I always have this slide on this just in case, but we're in a university space. I expect that, I'm an advocate for kind of the idea of academic freedom. We should have, rigorous contested discussion and debate in spaces like this. So, but I always put this up just in case, because I have had in the past one or two people who have not been happy with some of the content. There is nothing gratuitous in here, so if you've come to see gratuitous images, there's the front door, you can leave, basically. So you're going to be sorely disappointed. So you would have seen the abstract that was in the poster. I'm just kind of highlighting some of the key things here from that abstract. And it is really kind of, I suppose, looking at kind of micro to macro spaces around kind of sexuality, and particularly around the commodification of sex and sexuality as well. So I'm going to really kind of focus on two primary areas of commodified commercial sex. And that's really going to be pornography first as a kind of a global phenomena and kind of global suburbanisms. And then kind of bringing that down more to a kind of local context and looking at adult retailing. And invariably there's a kind of an overlap between the consumption of pornography, which is now mainly done online, but also the materials and the products that you can buy in an adult retail store, basically. Because there's a tie-in and a buy-in between, basically, I suppose, what you and I and others might consume when we watch pornography, in terms of some of the products that might be used and so forth, that ties it, and then the DVDs or the streaming stuff that you might be watching. So I tend to work in threes, so I've got this kind of broken down into three broad parts. So the first part is really looking at suburbia as this space of domesticity and conformity, or has it morphed into a space of perversity, and then kind of looking at the kind of socio-spatial and the socio-political distribution of pornography and adult retailing. And I'm going to draw on some kind of empirical data. On the pornography side of things, I'm looking at some of the headline kind of national global data that Pornhub, who are based here in Toronto, they kind of release this annual data set every year. They're kind of year in review, and they kind of show basically what our consumption patterns are. And they have billions of hits to their website basically every year. We're talking 25, 30 billion hits a year to their websites. And they break down basically what type of material that we are consuming and where is it coming from. So we'll kind of see these global circuits of pornography basically in some of the data that they release. And I'll highlight some of the issues around scale and kind of the analysis of that data. And then looking at more kind of micro scale stuff in terms of adult retailing, I'm going to look at really particularly Australia and kind of the geography of physical adult stores, but then also the virtual geography of of consumption from adult stores. I managed to get some data from 2 online stores in Australia, which allowed me to kind of map the distribution, the volume of sales, the type of sales that were basically being purchased at right down to a postcode level, basically. But we've kind of aggregated it up a little bit to kind of mask some, I suppose, in the name of confidentiality. So, in terms of, I suppose, rocking the suburbs. So I'm a teenager, a product of the 1980s, and I suppose when we look back at kind of, I suppose, popular culture and the sexualization of popular culture, there are a number of kind of artists for me that kind of really kind of stick in my mind, and I'm sure Roger will appreciate this artist first and foremost. And growing up in Belfast, which was a very heteronormative, in many senses, a very kind of asexualized environment in many senses. Sex wasn't discussed at home. Sex education was minimalist, if it even existed in school. So it was very much a kind of a taboo kind of issue. So for me as a teenager, when this somewhat kind of sexual ambiguous character came into my life in the mid-1980s when Purple Rain was launched, and then I backtracked to look at his back catalogue, there was this kind of really interesting kind of sexualized dimension to him. And he challenged lots of kind of norms around kind of sexuality in many ways. So, so he was from Minneapolis, and he was challenged, I think he was rocking the suburbs, both where he came from, and then he was rocking the suburbs basically in terms of the audiences that he was reaching out to. And in terms of both black and white suburbs, because he was a major crossover, as well as somewhat cross-dressing artist as well, here as this image shows. Oh. Second artist, of course, and this flips around, I suppose, the gender dimension to this in many senses, is looking at kind of the role that Madonna played in kind of the sexualization of popular culture and bringing sex, I suppose, to the fore in many senses. And this really kind of speaks, this popular sexualization, this popular culture sexualization, really kind of mimics what was going on in the sex industry itself, and particularly within adult retailing. We have seen that there are a number of, I suppose, female pioneers in adult retailing, basically, who have moved us away from the sex shop to what we call the erotic boutique, basically. And then in kind of more contemporary times, we kind of morph into kind of other areas of kind of ambiguity and kind of sexualization in popular culture. And where we have kind of Marilyn Manson and Lady Gaga as two kind of later icons who have kind of typified, what's going on kind of sexually and challenging, I think, what's going on in suburbia as well. So my Rocking the Suburbs is kind of is fueled a little bit by, I suppose, this kind of musical history in many senses and kind of looking at things. So as I said, on the front cover, we have these kind of pleasure tools that have emerged recently in the last 2 or 3 years, basically. And the Motorhead products in particular have evolved. This is now the kind of the second wave of products which have come out from Love Honey for Motorhead. So Lemmy lives on forever and ever, basically, in a sense that so Lemmy is God. Lemmy is now a sex god now too, basically. So bringing this together in some senses, really, and I think when we look at kind of what suburbia has kind of tended to represent, basically, Katrin Annika and I, and kind of looking at things for the book that we're working on, one of the kind of terms that we've been kind of messing around with is this notion that suburbia tends to be portrayed and tends to be represented by particular actors, and that would mainly be us to a large degree in terms of scholars, but also cultural elites basically see suburbia as this kind of landscape, basically. It's kind of, it's monochromatic, basically. It's got relatively little color and life in it. And I'm going to show you some kind of, I suppose, popular culture examples of where this blandness is supposedly kind of embedded into suburbia. So that blandness is tied in with notions of domesticity and conformity, because as we know, kind of historically, the suburbs were seen as through very kind of gendered lenses. It was a female-dominated space. It was where the family was ensconced during the work week, whilst the male jumped in his car, got on the train, and basically went into the city and worked in the office. Okay, and the mother tended to the children and looked after them, was the home manager, basically. In relational spatial terms, though, I think when we look at kind of the suburb versus the city and the dynamics and the conflict that exists between those two spaces, so suburbia is this submissive space in that relationship. It's tend to be betrayed in that sense. I see it somewhat differently. I see it actually much more as a kind of the dominant space, because most of us actually live in suburbia. Whereas most of us come to work in the city, real life, essentially, normal life is happening out in the burbs. So I kind of see this relationship structured in this sense, I suppose. So that landscape would have this kind of relationship where the female is submissive in a kind of suburban environment, and the male is the dominant character and actor in things. But I would contest that there's kind of a role reversal of that basically going on as the kind of the sex industry has evolved. And then also, I suppose, what's happening within suburbia in terms of its sexualization, basically. The emergence of erotic boutiques basically has put women in the driving seat in the bedroom, basically. Okay, so it may no longer call it the master bedroom. We might want to call it the mistress bedroom, basically, and that plays to the discourses which are played out in, I suppose, the branding and the commodification, basically, of the kind of sex industry, particularly through adult retailing. So I want to set this up to kind of these two images in particular in this kind of statement to kind of show that there's a really interesting kind of interrelationship going on in terms of the space that is the urban and the space that is the suburban, and the gendered relations that happen within those two spaces and between the genders. So as a space of domesticity and perversity. So this image is from my hometown of Perth. This is a massive subdivision in the northern suburbs, and you'll see this fence. I took a drive. This is quite an old photograph, but I kind of really like this photograph. It's a massive subdivision. I was kind of driving around, and there was this. This is a colour bond fence. Colour bond's a particular style of fencing that we use with great aplomb in Australia, in Australian housing. And this is just sitting in the middle of this massive subdivision. And when I kind of looked at it, I thought, there's suburbia, basically. There's a tsunami of suburbia coming over the horizon, and it's going to swamp, basically, the landscape here. So it got me kind of thinking, and it's also, and I put the letters on, these terms on here to kind of think, well, it's a good space for graffiti to be kind of sprayed on as well. And I think if we go back to what Mumford said, basically, about what suburbia represented, basically, you know, the description here screams basically the whole notion of kind of blandness that exists in suburbia, basically. The landscape that you kind of see here also symbolizes and expresses blandness in many senses as well. But my contention would be, once you lift the lid off those project homes, blandness goes out the window. There's adventure, there's risk-taking going on in these spaces, basically. There's experimentation. And in many senses, this fence is a good protector. You know, it lets us hide, you know, I suppose, what our kind of private actions and our private thoughts are, basically in terms of what happens in the suburban home, or indeed, basically, in a downtown apartment. Of course, if you're living right next door to someone in a downtown apartment and it hasn't got the best finish, you might hear what your neighbors are up to, basically. Okay, and so the whole idea of privacy kind of goes out the window. But you know that you're living in a sexed space, basically. So the idea is that suburbia is this space of domesticity, and it's heteronormativity and conformity, and it's all premised on the bedrock of patriarchy, basically. And it's this that kind of keeps that gendered relationships. And I think this patriarchy also kind of keeps that socio-spatial relationship going between what the urban represents and what the city represents and what the suburban represents too. So Stephen Rowley, who's an Australian scholar at RMIT, did this book last year, Movie Towns and Sitcom Suburbs, where he takes a kind of popular culture look at trying to unpack how suburbs have been represented in television and Hollywood. And Stephen's argument basically is that they're a mirror image of one another and they kind of influence one another, okay? So we inscribe things into suburbia and into the landscape, and at the same time it inscribes things back onto us, you know. And he comes up with a kind of a number of examples of, you know, I suppose, suburban stereotypes, which kind of highlight, you know, what, I suppose, what this manufactured suburbia is like. But at the same time, Stephen's making the point that suburbia has lots of these elements as well, basically, within them as well. Or Hollywood and these sitcom suburbs make us believe in the stereotype, basically. We translate them into reality. So he says here, I believe film and television depictions of community are always simultaneously shaping and shaped by broader social trends and policy. Over time, the relationship between the real world and cultural depictions could be visualized as two parallel and separately evolving threads, each of which constantly informs the other. So there is this kind of dialectical kind of relationship kind of going on. So when we kind of unpack this out into moving towards a kind of the sexualization of suburbia, the sexed character of suburbia. So this is a photograph that was of a suburban subdivision in New South Wales. And I think Phil Hubbard really kind of captures the essence of our concerns about kind of the sexualization of space, whether that's in the city, but I think particularly more so within the suburbs. And Phil says, you know, of all the uses of urban space, it is sex that remains the most contentious. And that contentiousness, I think, tends to be amplified in the suburban realm. We know that the urban is a space of kind of risk, adventure. You know, if you're going to kind of look at kind of authentic urbanism, well, you're going to have these weird and wonderful encounters downtown in a space where anonymity basically prevails, in a space where what Tanais would call, the contractual relationships that we have with one another. And contractual relationships is a good term because in terms of going to a strip club or having a kind of transactional sex with a sex worker, whether that's an on-street sex worker, an escort, or someone who works in a brothel, basically, it's based on a contract. And it's an economic contract, first and foremost. And then there's a kind of social and a personal kind of contract in there as well, basically, in terms of how you must behave in the relationship that you're in, the contractual moment that you're in. So Phil kind of makes this point about kind of the marital home, basically, and that's, that sex must be confined to that space, okay? And what's really interesting when you watch porn, most porn is recorded in a house. But generally, it's not recorded in the bedroom. It's in every room but the bedroom, basically. But it's still recorded in admittedly large suburban kind of mansions in and around Hollywood. But the home is the domesticated space, where porn is generally shot. It's not shot on sets, generally. There are a bunch of what are called, I suppose, basically porn houses, they've got a film permit that sits over them permanently, so that production can take place on a regular basis. So commodified sex in certain locations, particularly somewhere like Los Angeles, is constantly present. This commodified commercial sex is constantly taking place. And you wouldn't know it, in terms of, because it's, I think, the space that suburbia affords. Phil's also done some work looking at the impacts of brothels in Sydney, for example, with some other colleagues in Australia. And they asked local residents where brothels, sex work in Australia and New South Wales is decriminalised. And they did some work asking residents about, this was the noxious effects of other land uses of brothels, bars, and stuff like this. And most people in their surveys were unaware that a brothel even existed in their neighborhood. Because discretion is the name of the game, basically. So they behave, I suppose, in many senses they know that, I suppose, the spatial environment, the political environment that they're in, and they kind of work with that, basically, because they know that they will provoke kind of negative reactions. So we see this kind of typified. Some of you will probably remember this show, I Love Lucy, and that's I think what's really interesting in terms of this kind of cultural expressions of suburbia. I mean, the first thing there is always they're in separate beds. They're a married couple in a separate bed, and this is Hollywood portraying to us, that there's an asexuality basically going on here within this kind of space, within married life. Now, it's another kind of grab here, and this is, a little playful, subtle sex act in a sense, basically going on here. Although it probably wasn't portrayed as being kind of sexual at the time. It's more kind of like a child being kind of corrected and spanked for doing something wrong. But maybe it's me, but I see something sexualized in it, because then this imagery kind of basically mimics exactly that previous image, the act that's being portrayed. And where we're at now in terms of, thanks to E.L. James and 50 Shades of Grey, mummy porn, if you want to call it that, basically, that's what it's been described as. This is where we are at in many senses in terms of what's happening in suburbia. Suburban moms have bought into the whole kind of BDSM light, as Christine Steinmetz and I call it in our book, Suburban Sexscapes. And others have been critical, I suppose, authentic BDSM practitioners who are very critical of 50 Shades of Grey in terms of not just the literature, but I suppose the wider flow-ons from it in terms of people taking up the practice of what they might consider to be BDSM is challenged by real practitioners. So, anybody tell me where this suburb is or where it's from? And test your film knowledge. Edward Scissorhands. And what I like about this image basically is, so the uniformity of the built form is disrupted by the color. So I think what is happening in this movie, what Tim Burton's basically doing is he's being very playful with the whole notion of suburbia and saying, it is a landscape, but I'm going to mix it up and I'm going to put color into it. And he paints all these houses, these wonderful colors. And then he adds the kind of, so that's the physical dimension to it. And then he adds the gender dimension to it, basically. So the female protagonists in it. And, ironically, their color of their clothing more or less matches the color of their housing, So they're living in a technicolored world in many senses. But it represents a very kind of, sedate and straight form of suburbia, basically. But these women, basically, are essentially leading, in the movie, basically a very kind of sanitized sexual life, basically suburban life. Because when this guy comes along, they all desire him until, of course, he starts cutting their hedges and stuff like this here. At first they're suspicious about him, but it's desire and lust, basically. And I don't think it's any accident that Tim Burton has him dressed basically in leather, which is kind of emblematic of kind of leather culture in San Francisco and BDSM as well. There are clear sexual overtones to Edward Scissorhands. And then, of course, in porn parody is a big genre in the porn industry. And there's a porn parody for Edward Scissorhands. I'll let you guess what it might be, okay? You can go and Google it, but not at work unless you have permission to go and do that stuff. So, and we see this kind of sexualized kind of tension and issues around in suburbia about, I suppose, the conformity and perversity around it kind of coming through again, basically. And some of you might have seen this movie with Steve Martin. So this is from the movie Parenthood. And this is the scene just after one of the children basically walks out of their parents' bedroom with this vibrator, basically, and goes, "Mommy, what's this?" And it's kind of, and then the mother freaks out, basically. And then Steve Martin freaks out because he's unaware that his wife has this. Because essentially he's redundant. He's been made redundant by this. Now you flip this around in a way. So there was the suburban representation of this basically is it's a very private, matter. And then you flip it around to Sex and the City. And the gendered ownership of this, is completely amplified. So, and I think these two images really kind of capture that sense of ownership, and that sense of, in every sense of the world around pleasure and around sex here, basically. And that's not the toy that made Sex and the City famous. So it's a different toy. It was a rabbit toy, which is now the biggest selling adult product basically in the world, thanks to Sex and the City. So coming back to what Stephen Rowley was saying about kind of the interactions that, and I suppose the relationships that we have with culture, popular culture, and then how it comes back on to us. Well, this is I think these are kind of emblematic of that. And then this is kind of played out again in terms of when we go back to 1950s, suburban moms sitting around in living rooms, passing plastic around. But they're passing around utilitarian plastic for storing food, keeping it fresh with Tupperware. But the business model that Tupperware had, the party plan, has been appropriated by the sex industry. Ann Summers, who's the biggest adult retailer in the UK, they've adopted that model. They have these kind of party ambassadors, basically, whereby women will host other women in suburban living rooms or in apartments and will sell other forms of plastic. But it's not so much utilitarian per se, it's adventurous, it's experimental, it's for pleasure. And it's also about, I suppose, claiming a stake to kind of femininity and kind of, sexual agency in kind of postmodern world. So Lynn Camilla, who's at UNLV, has got a new book on this coming out this year, looking at feminist retail stores, adult stores. highlights this kind of notion that feminist sex toy businesses are important cultural sites for examining the proliferation and administration of sexual discourses. And looking at Foucault, she's really looking at the fact that how women have been able to kind of resist urban stroke suburban patriarchy, basically, by carving out this niche within retailing first, but that gives an outlet basically then for further expression for women in general, basically, to kind of stake claim to their own sexuality. And since those early stores that opened in the 1970s, there's been a kind of a proliferation of female-owned adult stores. So for me then, in terms of when we kind of look at sex, both within the urban and the suburban environments, basically, it all hinges around, I suppose, the ideas of our tolerance and where our tolerance levels basically are. And it's clear to me in many senses that, adult retailing is tolerated in the sense that we are mass consumers of it. The data is showing that lots of us consume adult retail, particularly online sites. But there are we seem to have a kind of limits to what we will tolerate that will be in our local environments, however we define those local environments. So sexscapes, commodified commercial sex spaces, occupy a really kind of nebulous kind of place. I mentioned earlier about what work that Phil Hubbard and Jason Pryor have done looking at brothels in Sydney. I mean, they just kind of are nestled into the urban environment, basically, and indeed the suburban environment. But that's under a regime where sex work is decriminalized. In other environments, you go to Las Vegas where sex work is legalized, but it's 60 miles outside Vegas itself. It's in the rural counties, which is kind of bizarre when you think about what kind of Vegas represents as a city of sin and vice, and the notion that, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Well, if you're going to have legal sex with a sex worker, you don't do it in Vegas. You have to do it out in the brothels, out in kind of rural Harump County, for example. So sex work and commercial sex spaces occupy these kind of really kind of, I think, marginal spaces, and they're kind of underpinned by this kind of precautionary and moral regulation that kind of sits around them. And that moral kind of regulation is mainly through political actors, because if you're looking at what the market's doing, the market's behaving in a very different way. The market is very liberated on this, basically. And by the market, I mean in terms of our consumption of commercial sex, whether that's with sex workers going to strip clubs and so forth, and also the production of it, in terms of who are the actors who are now involved in the production of commercialized sex. To the point now where people who are involved in cam work basically will set up one of these, get a bunch of followers basically, and then they'll put a performance on and broadcast it down the net from their bedroom or from their shower or from wherever basically, okay? And that's coming from the home, the basements in Toronto, probably. And it involves a whole kind of range of people involved in that. An increasingly large number of students. As we've moved to a world basically where you have, in a fee-paying university world, students have to eke out an existence, and a significantly large number of students have basically turned to various forms of sex work. And that kind of comes into this rather complicated diagram. And this is from the paper that we're going to be presenting at the AAG this week at a special session that we have, where we're looking at the kind of idea of sex work as a liminal space and trying to look at the kind of liminalities that cut across the notion that, so in the home and the workspace, sex work and, in terms of consumption, on this side of the equation, you've got a consumer citizen will enter into sex spaces, which are liminal. And they can be all sorts of weird spaces. They can be hotel rooms. They can be video viewing booths, basically. And then you've got kind of sex workspaces themselves, which is this kind of array of sex workspaces. and the interaction between the key actors who are involved in this, basically. So us as consumers and citizens, regulators, both planners and politicians, and then the producers of these services, basically, as well. And when they're in these kind of sex work spaces, the liminalities that kind of surround them, there are different constructions of what they actually mean. So for many regulators, sex work is seen as a space of immorality and abnormality, basically. It's a space of deviance. It's a space of exploitation. Whereas for sex workers, it's an economic space, but it's also a space of community and reinforcing one's identity as well. Much in the same way that, other kind of cultural minority and ethnic groups will kind of find, social capital in various spaces, physical spaces, whether that's, places of worship, community centers, schools, etc., and so forth. Sex workers do the exact same thing, basically. And one of those kind of key liminal spaces for that there is through social media, which has given them a lot of voice and a lot of agency to resist and challenge some of the arguments which are coming from this kind of level down here from regulators, as well as also what comes from this side, in terms of consumers, or citizens who may oppose commercialized forms of sex. So we're trying to make sense of kind of, I suppose, these kind of liminal dynamics that kind of sit around different forms of sex work. How am I doing for time? I don't see a clock here. Okay, right. So Pornhub here in Toronto, they do this year in review every year, basically. And when I look at this, so this is the headline data, basically. And I've been speaking to Pornhub probably now on and off for the last 2 years, trying to get access to the data. Okay, and it's taken a long, long time. And I finally cracked a nut to get some data about Australia. And I'm just kind of hoping that they'll kind of come through with it. But this data basically gives us an idea of kind of, at the national scale, basically, this is the traffic that comes to their websites. Now, Pornhub run a whole bunch of kind of tube sites, as they're called, offering free pornography. And it's not surprising that the US is number 1, the UK is number 2. You might find interesting that India is in there at number 3 in 2015. But more recently, last year, it's kind of interesting is that Canada has jumped up above India, into 3rd place. But for me, kind of looking at this, it's really, and this, I think will speak to some of the global suburbanisms ideas that Roger and colleagues have had here, basically, is that the top 3 basically are suburban nations. So I'm trying to make this, and trying to get access to some of this other data that Pornhub have, I'm trying to get it down to kind of finer scale to kind of see whether or not they're, how suburban is the consumption in many senses. And they can't get you right down to kind of individual suburbs or anything like this, but they can drill down a little bit down into kind of state and then city level as well, metropolitan region level. But I think my hypothesis on this is that a lot of this consumption is suburban in its direction. And when you look at, I've just taken, I suppose, these 3 big suburban nations. I think the US, Canada, and Australia are kind of very similar to one another. And there's a pattern, basically, to our consumption trends, basically, and our kind of likes, basically, when it comes to pornography. Very kind of similar stuff that is being consumed and watched, basically, across these 3 nations. What's really interesting, though, is the mobilities side of it, about how we access our pornography, basically. So in 2014, was that split between using our desktop and our phone. So for me, really, using the desktop, so that's either in the office or that's at home. That's where that consumption's happening, as far as I'm concerned. The phone kind of speaks to something that's a lot more publicly dynamic, but you can still obviously watch it, well, not only at home, but anywhere. Most recently, though, what's interesting is this shift towards the number of people basically who are accessing pornography on mobile phones. And that kind of raises lots of questions, I think, about, I suppose, the regulation about who can access pornography, basically. And I think this is, looking at the kind of suburban, and I'm going to use the word suburban with brackets around my sub, in terms of the mobilities and the dynamics around that, basically, in terms of, where and how we consume our pornography, basically. So I think this is kind of really interesting in terms of, where we are going and how do we control, how do regulators, officials, as well as parents, how do we ensure that we I suppose, protect those that are under 18 from accessing this material? Because it's designed only for, at least legally, for those who are adults. So what about adult retailing? So we have this kind of little spectrum of stores, and it basically, you go from the seedy and sleazy, so this is near King's Cross in London. This store is no longer there. You go to the corporate mainstream chain stores, and then you go to the high-end erotic boutiques. And these are male, masculine, heteronormative to the nth degree spaces. These are coupled spaces, whether that's heterosexual couples or LGBT couples, they tend to kind of service those. And then these Coco de Mer are basically, they're high income, high-end kind of feminine retail stores. And they're serving particular kind of markets, basically. So you've seen this kind of fracturing in the positive sense of that word, basically, within the sex industry. Because the sex industry is often seen as a kind of, male exclusive space, and certainly in a space like this Parrot bookshop, you can be guaranteed when you go into a store like that that the person working on the counter is going to be well into their 50s, bald, large, and glasses. If I can impose a stereotype. You go into these two spaces and you get a very kind of different consumer experience, basically, okay? So we have this kind of evolution going on in terms of stores, in terms of the feminization, the commodification of sexual pleasure, and then also, I suppose, what kind of underpins this, kind of the wider historical kind of contexts, particularly around kind of looking at sex toys, basically, as a cultural phenomena and a product, basically. Don't know if anybody has kind of seen the movie Hysteria. But the first vibrator was basically invented in order to ensure that doctors who were curing women of hysteria wouldn't get RSI, because they were helping women relieve themselves manually, the doctor. So you'll see here in this image, it may not be too clear, but this is a woman reclined with her legs parted, basically, and the doctor's providing her with assistance. Okay? And then the vibrator came along. The guy, one of these doctors, invented a vibrator so he didn't have to do the manual labor. And since then, adult toys have kind of morphed on. I don't know what's happened to that image, but it's disappeared. You'll see here the whole range of them, in terms of their design, the materials that they're used. I always say that these don't look like sex toys. They look like Bang & Olufsen telephones, because they've lost their phallicism. And it's a very clever way of basically being able to show these products in shop window displays, because they no longer cause outright offense. And you get into a position now where you can have a gold-plated vibrator for £10,000. Now, you're buying that, I think, as a collector's item, not for its utilitarian purposes. Oh, there it is. Sorry, it's come up on that one. So then it became an issue of kind of cosmetic surgery. These were kind of used to help you kind of, women to kind of, firm up their faces, basically. Yeah, right, that's what it was for. And if we look at kind of the geography of stores, this is Perth, where I'm from. So this is the CBD, kind of in here. There are about 40 stores in Perth. There's we've got about 1.7 million population. But they're spread out generally throughout kind of the suburban regions, basically in the Perth metropolitan area. There is a concentration in the CBD, and there are generally kind of older stores, which were kind of set up in the 1970s and 1980s. And you find a similar pattern in Sydney. There's a particular concentration in Sydney CBD, but then there's this kind of suburbanization of it, basically. But still very kind of tight regulations about what specific locations they can be in. Planners and certain councils in particular tend to be very kind of officious with some of their planning legislation about where these type of stores can be. What's really interesting in Sydney in comparison to Perth, so Sydney's held up as this global city. You won't find an adult store at street level. They'll either be up on the first floor or in a basement, lest they cause offence. Go to Perth, which is a country town, in terms of this, how we benchmark cities, and we don't have any problem with them being on kind of street level, basically. And I find that somewhat contradictory in many senses in somewhere like Sydney, given that sex work is decriminalised, they're happy with sex work, but yet when it comes to adult retailing, it's like, no, we've got to hide that in case somebody kind of, dies of shock of seeing something in a window, basically. So I mentioned earlier about E.L. James. This is where I suppose the mainstreaming of commodified sex has really kind of come to the fore, particularly within suburbia, in the last kind of 5 years, basically. And this commodification has extended out to a whole range of kind of products which have got the 50 Shades branding on them and where they were sold. So this poster was for lingerie, which is being sold in Target stores, in suburban malls, basically. Now, this poster got complaints against it, and then it was kind of ripped down because it was seen as offensive. And then the most recent movie for 50 Shades Darker, and this is on Sunset Boulevard, it's kind of showing you, I suppose, the exposure that this is having. The size of that billboard, it's about 5 stories high on a building there, basically. And that exposure is kind of very clear in the number of products and type of products which have been sold through the 50 Shades franchise, basically. But it's still seen as very sedate. It's not seen as authentic BDSM, basically. It's, as I said earlier, it's kind of BDSM light. It's artificial, it's plastic, in a cheap and tacky sense of the word, basically. Whereas if you go to somewhere like a store like the Pleasure Chest in Los Angeles, well, then this is where you're going to get a more authentic BDSM kind of retail experience, basically. But for Love Honey and for the stores that are selling 50 Shades product, it's been extremely profitable. So I've just got a few more to go. I'm just going to do some quick geography. So saying that we were mapping some online data that we got, basically, and this is from Love Honey in Australia. So we got, they give us a bunch of data on about 120,000 orders that were made, and this is kind of the distribution at the state level, but you can kind of see here on the map, we've kind of broken it down to, this is at what we call the SA3 level. So these are big kind of sub-regional areas. So the darker the shade, then the kind of the more consumption, basically, that's there. The interesting thing for us when we were kind of looking at this data was, I suppose, the overrepresentation relative to the population and then the percentage of orders, basically. And I'll just use West Australia as the case study since I'm from there. So we are the 10% state in the sense that 10% of the population lives in West Australia, although we have 1/3 of the land mass. And yet we're overrepresented when it comes to the percentage of orders which are coming from this online retailer. And then when we kind of broke it down a little bit further to try and kind of see where the sales were going in terms of geography, what we found kind of really interesting is that regional areas, so these are outside the major metropolitan areas, these are big kind of regional towns, they were the major consumers. So for us, in a sense, I suppose this is kind of country suburbia in many senses. So in these kind of inner regional areas, and then you're kind of heading out to kind of really rural areas. But there's massive overrepresentation in terms of relative population and the percentage of orders basically happening. And then we drilled this data down a little bit more to kind of look at the type of products that people were buying. And what we found basically was it was a kind of 50-50 split in the sense that certain products are, well, not exclusively for male use, but coupled use, but also for males. And when we looked at where the sales and the particular products were going to, they were going to mining towns, where there's a high proportion of men basically working there. There's no representation of males. So you'll get these slaves, or so with that and that, for example. So they're male slaves, and they're used for male pleasure, basically. And obviously you can use them in a coupled relationship, but we think that they're basically being used for self-pleasure. And then we wanted to look at politics. And we mapped the data up to kind of find out, look at where stuff was going in terms of the different states. And then we did it by political area. Let's see if this is the right one. Oh, sorry, it's the next one. Okay, we did it by electoral boundaries. We wanted to look at the kind of the politics of this. And we were looking at this in terms of the federal electorates. We're moving now on to look at the state elections. But it was interesting, though, is that most of the consumers live in areas which are basically what we call liberal, and that's our Conservative Party, just to make sure that that confuses some people in some places. So this kind of flies in the face in many senses, because it's normally seen that Conservative or liberal councils and liberal politicians in general basically tend to regulate the hardest basically against kind of commercialized forms of sex basically. And I know from speaking to various sex workers in the US via social media, they say they love when the Republicans and the Democrats have their conventions, in certain cities, because Republicans tip better than Democrats. So I think there's something in here about kind of, the conservative nature and attitudes towards sex amongst kind of Republicans and liberals is juxtaposed against their actual consumption patterns. And then this is the same data, but looking at it in terms of percentage value of share of sales as well. And what's interesting is that these numbers tally with the share of these politicians or these parties in the actual parliament as well, basically. So, last slide. Oh. Okay, so I think I'm using the term city here to kind of mean both, I suppose, the urban and the suburban, basically. And this is Perth. This is our CBD. So I've said, kind of wrapping things off here, saying the city has always offered the opportunity for sexual adventure, experimentation, and risk-taking, and so on. But ultimately, the people that come in here are obviously coming from the suburbs to take advantage of that risk. So it clearly is a kind of suburban experience as well as it is anything else. So I've said here is that, kind of wrapping up, coming back to that issue around the feminization and the commodification of sex, basically, there has been this kind of dramatic shift in kind of in the sex industry and in sexuality in general, where there has been this feminization within the modernist city vis-a-vis the production and distribution and consumption of commercial sex. And Ariel Levy talked about kind of raunch culture, for example, feminist porn, the emergence of feminist porn, kind of as I suppose a major subgenre within mainstream porn, and then sensuality boutiques, erotic literature, mommy porn, and also kind of erotic literature. So we end up with a kind of, we should look at the city through this lens. And I'm going to end there.